"What's wrong with your face?" The question rang out across the diner, loud and sharp like a dropped plate. It came from a young man at the back table, laughing a little too loudly with his friends. Heads turned. Some looked down at their meals, others at the man being mocked. He didn't react. The older man, whose name was Lawrence Larry Gaines, simply lowered his eyes, lightly touched the deep scar tracing down his left cheek, and reached for his worn coat. His movements were slow but deliberate, like he'd been through this exact moment more times than he could count. But before he could make it to the door, a chair scraped across the hardwood floor in the far corner. The sharp sound cut through the thick silence. A man rose to his feet, tall and composed, dressed in a smart shirt, the sleeve of his military uniform barely visible beneath his folded coat. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop. Time. He earned those serving your freedom. 6 words. Calm, steady, and heavier than anything else in the room. Larry paused mid-step. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Coffee cups froze mid-air. Conversations died mid-word. Even the air conditioner seemed to hush. The man who spoke was Brigadier General Mason Reed, visiting the town for a low-key meeting with the local Veterans Support Group. No press, no ceremony, just duty. And until that moment, no one had paid him any mind. Larry, 79, had a routine that hadn't changed in years. Every Wednesday at 8 a.m., he'd sit by the window at Annie's Diner in Springfield, Illinois, always with a black coffee and a book of crossword puzzles. He liked the early hour, the quiet before the breakfast crowd took over. The sunlight hit the booth just right, softening the contours of his face and dimming the vividness of the jagged scars he carried. Those scars had history. One curved from temple to jaw, rough and deep. Another trailed from his eyebrow across his scalp, disappearing under his thin gray hair. They weren't just scars, they were chapters. And while most people chose not to ask, some couldn't help but stare, or, worse, speak without thinking. Larry never blamed them. People feared reminders of pain, of sacrifice, of consequences they themselves had never faced. He had long accepted that some people looked away not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. But this young man wasn't looking away. He was pointing, laughing. The moment had turned the mood in the diner to ice. The barista froze mid-pour. An elderly couple nearby exchanged glances. Even the young man's own friends looked uneasy now. One muttered, "Dude, maybe chill." But the damage was done. Larry didn't show a flicker of anger. His discipline was like armor, polished by decades of service and the silence that followed. He placed his spoon neatly on the saucer, shrugged into his coat, and began to walk away. That's when General Reed stood. His presence was commanding, even without insignia on display. He stepped forward, not rushing, but with the calm urgency of someone who had led men into war zones and understood the power of presence. "Those marks, he got them saving lives," he said, turning slightly so his voice carried. "He pulled 4 men out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar. 3rd-degree burns. Nearly died. One of those soldiers was my brother." The last sentence dropped like a boulder. A quiet gasp broke from someone in the back. The young man who had spoken turned pale. His jaw opened, but no words came. The rest of his group stared at the table, their faces flushed with guilt. General Reed walked toward Larry, stopping beside him. He didn't salute, but his stance spoke volumes. "Permission to speak, Sergeant?" he asked. Larry, lips twitching slightly into a half smile, one side of his mouth still pulled by scar tissue, nodded. "Go ahead, sir." Reed faced the room. Again. "You mock what you don't understand," he said, locking eyes with the young men. But this man didn't hesitate when others would have. He stayed behind so others could live. Reaching into his coat, the general pulled out a small box, black velvet, weathered with age. He placed it gently on Larry's untouched table. "My brother carried this until the day he died. said it belonged to the man who saved him. We were never able to deliver it properly. Inside was a bronze star, gleaming under the diner lights, alongside a slightly faded citation bearing the signature of the Secretary of the Army. The barista stepped forward, eyes glassy. "Would you like a fresh cup, sir? It's on us," she said, voice trembling. Larry hesitated, hand hovering over the booth's edge. He wasn't used to being seen, not really, but something in the air had changed, like the weight of invisibility had lifted, if only slightly. He sat. The young men still sat frozen, looking smaller than before. One leaned over and whispered to the others. Soon, phones were pulled out. One showed something to the group, a news article, a photo. Their eyes widened as the realization hit. Larry simply sipped his coffee again, unbothered. The sun still poured through the glass. A fresh cup was placed beside him. And for the first time in years, people looked, not away, but toward. The air inside Annie's diner had shifted. What was once just another Wednesday morning had become something no one in that room would forget. Even the traffic outside still, humming past as usual, felt strangely distant, as if the world outside didn't belong to this moment. Larry didn't touch the medal. Not yet. It sat beside his coffee like a quiet companion. He had lived a long life trying to avoid attention. But in that silence, for the first time in years, he felt something stir. Not pride exactly, but a kind of release. He wasn't alone anymore. General Reed returned to his table, nodding once to Larry before sitting down and picking up his pen like nothing had happened. But the atmosphere hadn't returned to normal. It couldn't. The barista moved quietly, her hand still trembling slightly as she cleaned behind the counter. At another booth, a gray-haired woman gently tapped her fingers on the edge of her teacup, then looked toward Larry and gave a soft, respectful nod. The businessman who'd been too busy tapping away at emails minutes earlier now slowed as he passed Larry's booth and offered a quiet, "Thank you, sir." And then the phones came out. Word spread like wildfire. By that evening, a short clip, shaky, recorded from someone's phone, had already gone viral. It captured General Reed's voice, steady and powerful. "He earned those serving your freedom." By nightfall, the video had hit 100,000 shares. By the next morning, millions had seen it. Headlines appeared across social media feeds and news outlets. Viral diner moment leaves crowd speechless. Veteran mocked until military. Hero steps in. 6 words that silenced a room. The scars of honor. Comment sections exploded with gratitude. I cried watching this. We forget too easily what others endured. Those scars are medals written in flesh. Thank you, sir. To the kids who mocked him, may this be your wake-up call. Veterans from across the country began sharing their own stories, some visible, some invisible. Stories they had long kept buried. And Annie's diner, once just a quiet spot for breakfast and coffee, suddenly became a symbol. The next day, the same group of college students returned. They weren't loud this time. No laughter, no arrogance, just quiet footsteps and lowered eyes. They approached Larry's booth, where he sat once again with his crossword puzzle and steaming black coffee. One student held a bouquet of sunflowers. Another clutched a letter, edges folded and creased from nervous fingers. The third extended a small paper bag with a pin inside, a simple emblem reading, "Honor First." The young man who had spoken so carelessly was the first to find his voice. "We were stupid, sir. We didn't know. We're sorry." Larry looked at their faces. Faces that reminded him of his own squadmates from decades ago before time and war changed everything. He nodded once. "Then make sure you remember this moment," he said. "Use it. Don't waste it. That's all I ask." Behind them, a young woman sitting nearby quietly wiped tears with her napkin. Her boyfriend leaned over and whispered that her older brother had been injured in Afghanistan. She hadn't stopped thinking about him since the story broke. By the weekend, the owner of Annie's diner, who had been out of town during the incident, returned and took immediate action. He removed several paintings from the back wall and replaced them with something more important. He added framed photos of local veterans, letters, patches, a copy of Larry's Bronze Star citation. At the very top, a new wooden sign read, "We serve more than meals. We serve those who served." It wasn't just decor, it was a message, a reminder, a promise. Though Larry never asked for it, people began to recognize him everywhere. Some stopped him just to say thanks. Others quietly covered his bill. More often than not, fellow veterans would place challenge coins by his coffee without saying a word. A silent exchange understood only by those who had worn the uniform. But perhaps the most unexpected development came the following week. General Reed returned, this time not alone. A small media crew followed him in, carrying cameras and folders marked Department of Veterans Affairs. He approached Larry's booth with a respectful smile. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," he said, "but we've launched something called Scars of Service, a national outreach to educate young Americans about what sacrifice really looks like and what it costs." Larry blinked, surprised. Reed continued, "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs himself asked if you'd consider being its first ambassador." At first, Larry was hesitant. Public speaking, campaigns. He had spent years trying not to be seen. But after some thought, he agreed, not for himself, but for the soldiers still carrying their own silent burdens. Soon after, Larry began visiting high schools. Students asked questions, some silly, some heartbreaking. One curious fourth grader asked, "Did it hurt?" Larry chuckled, "Yes, but not as much as being forgotten." The same student who had mocked him that morning at the diner now helped him set up at events. Another had taken an internship at the nearby VA clinic. The third had started a student group to connect college students with veterans in the community. A month later, the mayor held a private event in Larry's honor. Annie's diner was closed for regular business that day. Instead, the booths were filled with service members, police officers, firefighters, teachers, and Larry's old army friends. "You reminded this town of something we'd lost," the mayor said, unveiling a small plaque to be mounted by the door. "Valor isn't always worn on a chest. Sometimes it's written in the skin. And sometimes it's invisible. But it's always there, waiting to be acknowledged." When it was Larry's turn to speak, he stood slowly. The room held its breath. "I didn't do anything special," he said softly. "I just didn't leave my brothers behind. None of us would have." Reed, standing nearby, nodded. A gesture so slight, yet filled with weight. In that one nod lived an entire story of service, loss, loyalty, and the kind of respect that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. Now, at Annie's diner, there's a permanent table. One chair, a folded flag, a shadow box with Larry's photo and medals, and a small plaque that reads, "Reserved for the ones who stayed." Larry still shows up every Wednesday. Same table, same coffee. But now, children wave. Veterans stop, buy and leave tokens of respect. People no longer stare at his scars. They see through them and into the strength behind them. One afternoon, a teenage girl approached him nervously. "My grandpa has scars too, from Vietnam. He never let us ask." Larry gently placed a calloused hand over hers. "You don't need to ask him anything. Just sit beside him. That's enough." Reed still visits. No fanfare, no cameras, just two old soldiers sharing coffee and weather talk. And when a new diner guest looks too long at Larry's face, someone always leans over and says quietly, "That man, he's the reason you get to sit here in peace." The Scars of Service campaign is now in 40 states. Veterans share their stories not to glorify war, but to help the next generation understand the human cost of peace. Larry keeps his Bronze Star in its box at home. He doesn't need it out. His real reward is the changed air when he walks in. The nods, the silent thank yous. For a man once reduced to his scars, Being truly seen is the greatest honor of all.